Hey there, my name is Salandrak and welcome to part 2 of my comprehensive beginner's guide series for RimWorld. Last time we went over new game settings, talked about the AI storytellers, and learned how to pick decent starting pawns. And today we're going to be mostly focused on the whats and whys of planning your base. Along the way we'll cover mood considerations, drugs, how to set up stockpiles and crafting bills, and a few other tips and tricks. And then next time we'll put it all into practice, set up worker priorities, and cover all sorts of gameplay mechanics and concepts, including combat and wealth management. As always, chapter links are down in the description if you're looking for info on a specific topic or need to come back later, and I would love it down in the comments if you have any other tips or tricks you think new players should know about. Now let's get to it! When we left off, we had just crash landed onto the planet and paused the game and saved the world in its starting position. The next thing I like to do in a new world is get the lay of the land and take a good look at the map, starting with toggling on the fertility overlay with the little flower icon in the bottom right corner of the screen. This will highlight areas of rich soil in dark green, which will grow most crops faster than normal soil, which is a pale green color, and an intemperate forest will be most of the map. Stony soil areas are a yellow color and work okay for growing potatoes but not much else, and should generally be avoided unless there's nothing better available, which can happen on certain map types. On this map there's a big area of fertile soil on the west side, but you generally don't want to be building or growing anything that close to the edge of the map, as it will be a much easier target for raiders. This centralized area of fertile soil will work well enough for early gardens, and later on I might expand to some of the other patches up and to the left, or just build an indoor hydroponic garden somewhere. Note that the brown areas of muddy soil are unable to support crops as well as structures such as walls and floors, so I'll have to work around those until later in the game when I can make moisture pumps. You can also highlight unbuildable terrain by toggling on the Terrain Affordance overlay, which is the little mountains icon next to the fertility overlay button. Once I've located some good growing locations, the next thing I'll look for is steam geysers, which, once geothermal power has been researched, will be great sources of consistent electricity. An easy way to locate them all is to find one of them and then right-click on the Select Similar button at the bottom of the screen and choose Select Similar Things on Map. This will tell you how many total geysers are on the tile and put brackets around them so you can spot them more easily. On this map there's one located very nicely in the middle of the map and a second one off to the left that isn't too close to the edge. The pair at the bottom of the screen are a bit too remotely located, and the duo on the right side are rather close to the edge, but having two that are in good locations is definitely a positive. The next thing to take a good look at are the shapes and positions of the hills, and ask yourself a few questions. Where are good defensive choke points? What areas will be open and exposed? And are there any ancient dangers that you'll need to be aware of? I don't see any on this map, but here's an example from another one. An ancient danger is a walled and roofed off area that is usually partially if not fully buried in a hillside. If a pawn gets too close to this danger, there will be a pop-up warning, but for now just make a mental note of the location and make sure you never accidentally mine or otherwise cause the wall to be opened up, as inside there might be mechanoids or insects that could easily destroy your fledgling colony. Once you've got good weapons and armor for your colonists, you'll probably be ready to crack it open, but for now just ignore it. My current map doesn't really have much in the way of defensive features. I'll probably use this big hill as my northern border and wall off this section to the northeast. Similarly, I'll probably wall off the southern open area, and on my western side do the same, using existing structures as needed. Overall though, it looks like there is plenty of open space in the middle, lots of normal soil and a few good patches of fertile soil, and one or two steam geysers I'll be able to make use of. Here's an example of another map, this time with large hills rather than small. On this map there's a nice area of fertile soil within a ring of hills, and a smaller patch to the right near a marshy area. There's one steam geyser beautifully placed in the middle of the map, but the rest are to the north and would be hard to utilize, as is the large patch of fertile soil up there. The hills form a nice protective ring around the top side of the central area, and walls could be built upwards from the big southern hill, making those sides well protected as well, leaving plenty of open space for building a base in the middle. There is an ancient danger though in the central hill, so I'll need to be careful in that area until I'm ready to face whatever waits inside. Once you've gotten the lay of the land, it's time to start planning where you'll build your base. Now, I personally like to draw out all my key buildings using the planning tool, which, if you don't have the More Planning mod, is located under the Architect Orders menu. You'll only have a single color to work with, but at the very least can use it to outline where walls will be built, maybe leaving empty spots to represent doorways. If you do have the More Planning mod, which I highly recommend, there will be a planning menu under Architect, and you'll have 9 additional colors and the ability to cut, copy, and paste plans, which is great for setting up lots of bedrooms and moving things around. Now, as far as the types of rooms you'll want to build for your base, there are actually several. Naturally, you'll want bedrooms for all of your colonists, a freezer for storing perishables, a kitchen for preparing meals, and a dining room for dining. You'll also want a rec room for entertainment, which early on can be combined with a dining room, as well as a large storage area, a workshop, and a research lab. Initially, you'll probably use extra bedrooms for prisoners and medical beds, but once you've gotten the basics established, you'll want a dedicated hospital and maybe a dedicated prison block. Some miscellaneous areas you'll want are a battery storage area, places for solar panels and windmills, a barn and surrounding pasture, maybe some indoor grow areas, and of course, defensive positions, including possibly a kill box. Do note that there is a lot of personal preference when it comes to base organization and layout. I personally like to use 3 tile wide hallways between my buildings and have my larger rooms be 11 tiles wide by 11 tiles tall, partly so I can have doors placed nicely in the middle of the walls. Overall, I like the base to have a fairly realistic feel, but this is an area where there are lots of ways to skin the proverbial cat. So feel free to experiment and figure out what works best for you and your personal playstyle. Before we start talking about how to make and arrange your rooms and whatnot, now's a good time to talk a little bit about mood, which is something you'll need to manage for each of your colonists throughout the game. And the reason I want to talk about this now is because the layout of your base can directly impact those all-important moods. A pawn's mood is primarily determined by whether or not their basic needs for food, rest, and recreation are being met, but can also be influenced by a whole host of other factors or thoughts, including social interactions, the environment, and all sorts of events. Some of these you have pretty direct control over, like whether or not they have a nice bedroom or sufficient forms of entertainment available, but many of them will be determined by the storyteller, such as whether or not a conversation between 2 pawns has uplifting compliments or is filled with negative insults. The key with mood though is to be constantly keeping an eye on it, which is why mods like Moody, RimHUD, or color-coded mood bar is so helpful. If you aren't playing with these mods, you'll want to regularly cycle through your pawns with the Needs tab open to see what all is influencing their moods, and then do what you can to fix any problems, or maybe have them drink a beer or smoke a joint. The easiest way to quickly scan through your population is simply to push the comma and period keys on your keyboard to move through the pawns to the left or right respectively. By reviewing your pawn's moods regularly, you can hopefully nip problems in the bud before they get out of control and turn into catastrophes. If a pawn's mood gets too low, they can be at risk for having various types of mental breaks, which is never a good thing, though the catharsis they'll get afterwards will make them quite chipper for several days. Along with mood, I also want to talk a little bit about drugs in RimWorld. In the first video, I suggested avoiding starter pawns that have the chemical interest or fascination traits, and especially avoid starter pawns that have a drug addiction. For the addicts, early on you probably won't be able to satisfy their chemical needs, and this will lead to some severe mood debuffs and probably minor and or major mental breaks before the addiction is ended. Pawns with chemical interest or fascination will have constant mild debuffs until you start giving them some drugs, which can take a while to get up and running. But once you do have enough of a supply, pawns with these traits or even addictions really aren't too bad to manage, and binges can be avoided entirely so long as they are able to get high on a regular basis. Just set them up on a schedule of a beer every night and psychite tea every other day, and maybe joints now and then and ambrosia if you have it, and they should be fine. Just do not put them on a no drugs policy, or they will binge and likely get addicted at one point or another. But aside from satisfying addiction or trait needs, drugs in RimWorld can be extremely useful as a tradable commodity and as short-term mood and even performance boosters. So here's what you need to know to be able to use them as safely as possible. There are basically three categories of drugs in RimWorld: soft drugs, hard drugs, and luciferium. Soft drugs include beer, psychite tea, smoke leaf, and wild-growing ambrosia. These drugs can be used regularly without risk of addiction every 1 to 2 days. Just check the info tab for the safe dose interval. Each time a pawn takes a dose, they'll gain some tolerance to the drug, but so long as their tolerance isn't above the drug's new addiction minimum tolerance, they will have zero risk of developing an addiction. If their tolerance is above that threshold, then there will be a small chance for an addiction to form. Hard drugs, on the other hand, have a chance to cause addiction regardless of tolerance level and from the very first dose. These drugs have much stronger effects on mood and can also decrease rest needs and even improve work speed or combat performance. Because of their inherent risks, they should be used sparingly and for specific purposes beyond just boosting mood, such as go juice to turn the tide of battle or wake up for an exhausted doctor after a bad fight. Luciferium gets a category of its own, as it will always addict anyone that takes it on the first dose, and the withdrawal symptoms will result in death. So never recruit a pawn that's addicted to it, and don't let one of your pawns take it unless you have a stockpile built up already. That said, if you can keep its user well supplied, it provides amazing performance enhancements and can even heal old wounds. Now, if you do want to have drugs in your colony, there are a couple of settings you'll need to tweak to make it as safe as possible. For starters, never use the game's default social drugs policy, as it will allow pawns to get drunk or stoned for entertainment, which will result in inebriated pawns when a raid happens to show up on your doorstep in the middle of the night. Instead, it's generally best to set your pawns to no drugs and then manually instruct them to take a soft drug when they need a mood boost, or a hard drug when they need its particular performance boosting benefits. As noted earlier, if you have a chemical interest or fascination pawn in your town, you may want to set up a new policy that allows them to use all the soft drugs on a schedule that has them high on each particular drug infrequently enough to risk any addictions. Similarly, if you have a pawn that has a really bad mood, chronic pain, or recently went through a breakup, you may want to set up a specific policy to help bolster their mood with soft drugs. With that basic understanding of mood and drugs under your belt, let's start talking about rooms in conjunction with planning your base, starting with your kitchen, freezer, and dining room. I like to cover these three together because being closely related to each other, they also work really well when placed closely next to each other. Also, since the kitchen is the heart of the home, I often like to start planning my base first with the kitchen complex and then build out from there, and will generally use my planned dining room as my starter barracks for my pawns, which we'll talk about in a minute. A freezer is made in RimWorld by making a room and then placing one or more coolers found under the temperature tab of Architect, and then cranking the temperature to below freezing. In a starter crash-landed colony, it will need to be powered by a wood generator, and depending on the size of the room and temperature ranges of the map, you may need 2 or even 3 coolers to maintain an appropriate temperature. Depending on the size of your colony, you may want a freezer that is at least around 30 to 50 tiles in total area, and probably with room to expand later on if needed. Type of wall doesn't matter for insulation purposes, but if you're on a particularly hot map, you may want to build a double thick wall, which will improve insulation, though I've never found that necessary on a temperate map. Because cold air will rush out whenever the door is open, it's a good practice to make a small hallway leading into the freezer as a sort of airlock. This will help the freezer to maintain a consistent temperature even when the doors keep getting opened and closed. Next to the freezer, you'll want a small room to serve as your kitchen where stoves can be used to make a variety of different meals. Surprisingly, it's a good idea to leave the floor of this room as dirt. The reason for this is that if a room is dirty, meaning dirt or trash has been tracked onto the floor, then once the dirtiness exceeds a certain level, the risk of food poisoning starts to go up. But since dirt can't be tracked onto a dirt floor, it will be much less likely to ever get dirty enough to cause any problems. This risk of dirty, non-dirt floors is well mitigated if you have the Common Sense mod enabled, which will encourage your cooks to clean the room before cooking. Dirt is also less of a problem later in the game when you have dedicated cleaners or can afford to place sterile tiles in the kitchen, which will provide a positive cleanliness benefit. Starting out, you'll only need a single stove, and I'll generally skip the fueled stove and go straight to an electric one. As your colony gets bigger though, you may end up wanting 2 or more dedicated chefs and more than one stove so you can have them cook simultaneously. The vast majority of the time you'll want to make fine meals, which give a decent +5 mood buff, though it does require a cooking skill of 6 to make, which is usually the lowest skill I would want to have making meals anyway, due to the increased risk of food poisoning for skills 5 and below. To set up the cooking bill, I usually prefer the do until you have X option, and set the number to probably 4 times the number of pawns and prisoners in the colony. That way, if there is an interruption to my food supply or ability to prepare meals, I'll have some buffer before people start to go hungry. It's also a good idea to stockpile extra simple meals, and once you've researched them, survival meals and/or pemmican for emergencies and caravans. A few lavish meals can also be made and used to give a 24-hour +12 mood boost to anyone that is grumpy, though I wouldn't use these regularly and generally assign my pawns to fine meals, as lavish meals are pretty inefficient in terms of inputs per meal. Also, if you have any low-skilled cooks assigned to cooking to, for example, do your butchering, go ahead and set a minimum skill level for meals to keep these chefs in training out of the kitchen. The efficiency of your chefs can be boosted quite a bit by making sure ingredients are within reach of the stove so they don't have to go back and forth to the freezer before making each meal. If you're using the RimFridge mod, you can place a small freezer to either side of the interaction spot and set one fridge to hold meat and the other fridge to hold vegetarian ingredients. With RimFridge, you can also place a wall fridge connecting to the dining room to store prepared meals, so the chef can place them from the kitchen side and hungry pawns can grab them from the dining room. If you don't have that mod, you can also place stockpiles on the floor or shelves next to the stove. With these latter options, you'll want to make sure the kitchen stays cold enough for any kitchen ingredients to be at least refrigerated if not frozen, though you'll also need to ensure that your chef has appropriate clothing for these lower temperatures. Instructing the chef to drop meals on the floor will also save time that would otherwise be spent running back and forth to the freezer, though if your haulers aren't on the ball, you may need to occasionally instruct someone to move the meals, as they won't be counted towards the quantity required by the cooking bill if the meals aren't in a stockpile area. This counting issue can be somewhat negated by placing a stockpile on the floor, then setting up the bill to take the food to that specific stockpile. Just be sure to set the stockpile to low priority so your haulers will move the meals to the freezer. In order to process animal corpses, you'll need to also set up a butcher table, and due to the filth it creates, you do not want this to be in the kitchen. A small room somewhere nearby works well, or you can simply put it in the freezer, though the cold temperatures will decrease work speed and you'll need to make sure anyone working at the table has warm enough clothing. For the butcher table, just set a butcher creature bill to do forever, but maybe toggle off insect corpses unless you plan on using them for animal kibble, as your colonists think meals made with bug meat is disgusting. If you don't have a good chef, then your best food option is actually the Nutrient Paste Dispenser, or NPD for short. Although these meals will give your pawns a small mood debuff, this is far less bad than getting food poisoning due to a bad chef, and as a food source, Nutrient Paste is actually super efficient in terms of the inputs required to make a meal to feed your people, requiring only 6 raw ingredients, whereas simple meals and fine meals take 10. The dispenser itself is pretty large, but its body functions as a wall, allowing you to place the access point in your dining room with the body extending back into your freezer. You'll need to construct hoppers adjacent to it, which will then be filled with raw ingredients, and the dispenser will do the rest. Whenever a pawn is hungry, they'll just walk up, pull the lever, and walk away to eat their meal. Now, one of the downsides of the NPD is that it won't function if it doesn't have electricity, and a solar flare event will make it useless until the power comes back on. There are a few methods to mass produce paste meals for storage, but I personally don't like to use them as they seem like a bit of an exploit. If you want to know how to do this, there's a link to the wiki article that explains down in the description. Otherwise, in the case of a power outage, your next best bet is to eat berries, which give no debuff for being eaten raw, though they do have a fixed 2% chance to cause food poisoning. And if you don't have enough berries on hand, go ahead and fire up a stove or cook some basic meals at a campfire and hope that nobody gets sick. Getting back to our new colony, here I've planned out the location of my future freezer and dining room, complete with airlock hallway and a closet for the butcher table, which will also function as an airlock. The dining room is my standard preferred 11 by 11 size, with the kitchen and freezer going back from there. I picked this location since I want the freezer to be next to the rich soil, and will maybe add additional gardens below the freezer on the regular soil. Since I'll be using a nutrient paste dispenser until I get a good chef, I'll probably just place it in the freezer area. I'll be using wooden walls for my early builds, and will construct them within the final planned area, and then later when I've got enough stone brick, we'll build the stone walls on the plan lines, and then deconstruct the wood walls within the still frozen freezer so no food has a chance to spoil. Now before we move on to another type of building, I want to pause a moment and talk about stockpile zones. Items and ingredients must be in a stockpile in order for your colonists to view them as available for most purposes. These are created under the Architect Zone menu, and there are two types, stockpiles and dumping stockpiles. By default, everything is enabled for a stockpile zone except for chunks, plants, and corpses, while the dumping stockpile zone has everything disabled except for chunks and corpses. For general storage purposes, these settings work fine, but there will be times that you'll want specific storages for specific types of items, and the freezer is a good example. To actually store the things you'll want to store in your freezer, simply hit the Clear All button, increase the priority to Preferred, and then change the Allow Rotten selection to an X. This is so that rotten corpses won't be stored in your freezer because A, that's gross, and B, you can't butcher them for food anyways. Then click the button to allow foods, and towards the bottom of the list, press the button to allow animal corpses, and voila! You got a dedicated food storage area where hunters can deposit their fresh kills. You also might want to allow herbal medicine, as they will slowly deteriorate if not frozen, as well as plant matter under the raw resources category. Later in the game, you may want to set up additional freezer areas, or even separate out this area into different types of items, such as one area for crop produce, another one for meats, and yet another area for prepared meals, particularly if you're building a stockpile for caravans. Similarly, with your main storage area, a general stockpile is fine in the early game, but later on you might find that you want specific areas for specific types of items, such as clothing, weapons, or armor, so you can find them easily. Because pawns get a mood penalty for wearing clothing that has less than 50% item HP, I'd like to have a small stockpile set to hold good apparel by using the sliders to set minimum HP and quality levels, and we'll try to keep at least one or two of each basic type of clothing item on hand at all times. That way I can see at a glance if I need to make more of a particular article of clothing, and so there will always be clothes available when an article becomes tattered or a new recruit needs to get dressed. If you don't want the unsightly effect of stuff lying around on the floor, shelves can be used to avoid the beauty penalty of a cluttered floor. The next type of room I want to cover is bedrooms. In the very early game, it's perfectly fine to just throw a couple of beds into any old room, thereby forming a barracks, and call it good until you can make individual bedrooms. As I mentioned earlier, I'll frequently do this with my planned dining room, as getting my kitchen and freezer up and running is a top priority in a new game. The pro of this approach is you can get your starter pawns sleeping in beds really fast, which is far better than sleeping outside or on the ground. The con is that they won't like it very much, as it takes a pretty fantastic barracks to not get a mood debuff, whereas even a modest bedroom can yield a positive mood benefit. Additionally, with people coming and going while others are sleeping, pawns in a barracks will likely get interrupted sleep debuffs on a regular basis, but as a short-term solution it works perfectly fine. As for bedrooms, and this is actually true for several types of rooms, including dining rooms, rec rooms, and hospitals, the degree to which it provides positive or negative mood effects depends on its impressiveness, which is a function of 4 factors, namely wealth, beauty, spaciousness, and cleanliness, with the weakest of the 4 in a given room having the greatest weight. For size, about the smallest you'll want a benefit-giving room to be is around an area of 25 tiles, or interior dimensions of 5 by 5 or 6 by 4, not including the walls. A bigger room will be needed if you want to really wow your pawns, but that starts to take up a lot of space, especially for bedrooms, so I'll oftentimes go a little bit smaller for sleeping quarters. Pawns won't get much or any mood benefit from sleeping in these small rooms, but they generally won't be a negative either. Each bedroom will need to have a bed, and if you've got a married couple or a couple of lovebirds, they'll want a double bed so that they can engage in other mood-boosting activities. Higher quality beds are always preferred, as less sleep will be needed to get fully rested. Comfort can be increased by placing an end table next to the bed's pillow and/or a dresser in the room, though the benefit of this is dubious. If made with valuable materials though, these bedroom furniture items can help to improve its wealth and beauty, and I sometimes like to make them just because I think it looks nice. There's no need to have lights in the bedrooms unless a pawn is getting bed rest while recovering from illness or injury, but you'll probably want to have a heater and cooler in the middle rooms with vents connecting to the neighbors to ensure comfortable sleeping temperatures. Later on, when you've got a good artist, a sculpture can bump up the beauty and wealth factors, pushing the room into the territory of an impressive room with a nice positive mood buff. I generally like to have my bedrooms as close to my dining room as possible, as the first thing pawns will usually do when they wake up is go get a meal, and if they already have a meal in their inventory, they'll only make it to the dining room if they are somewhat close to a table and chair. This is important because not eating at a table gives them a debuff, while eating in an impressive dining room will boost their mood. If at any point in time you notice certain pawns regularly having the "ate without table" thought, it might be worth watching them to see where they're spending their time, and maybe making a small dining room at the places they're frequently working that are too far from your main dining room. Back to my new world in planning, for this world I think I'll build a split bank of 8 medium-sized rooms along the east side of the kitchen complex, and then some smaller rooms to the north and to the west. This arrangement will house up to 14 colonists in single beds, more if they start shacking up with each other, which is right in the ballpark of the 10 to 16 pawns I usually like to have in a town. Depending on how many I actually end up with, some of these rooms may be reconfigured into a prison block with smaller cells, or maybe I'll add some more rooms further off to the right. As before, here's what it looks like in its planned state, and here's what it looks like when fully built. Once I've got my kitchen complex and bedrooms planned out, it's time to flesh out the base with everything else. I generally like my rec room to be across from or kitty corner from the dining room to ensure pawns will want to hang out there. But since this map has that centralized steam geyser, I'm going to put it off to the side a little bit and put my research lab below the geyser. I'll eventually have a high-tech research bench which has a footprint of 5x2 tiles, so this room will be a perfect size for the lab, able to fit 2 high-tech benches or maybe 1 bench and a fabrication table which is also 5x2. On the left of the base is where I'll have my workshop and main storage areas. Like my dining and rec rooms, I like my workshop to be 11x11, and the main stockpile area will be a large 17x17 room. This is so that later I can have an orbital trade beacon in the center, which will allow you to buy and sell goods to passing starships. Do note that walls will only support ceilings up to 6 tiles away from the wall, so this storage area will need a few internal support columns to ensure that the roof doesn't collapse. I'll probably build a smaller stockpile room taking up about a quarter of the full area initially, so I can get it fully enclosed sooner rather than later, and then expand it with stone walls once I've got enough bricks stored or need more storage space. Also, placing the main stockpile next to the workshop is a good idea because pawns won't have to travel as far to get any crafting ingredients they might need, and I might even put shelves holding specific ingredients on the other side of the shared wall. To the left of the rec room, I'll place a battery room. Once you've researched batteries, you'll want to build at least 2 banks of 4 or so batteries and separately connect them to the power grid using switches. Connect one set of batteries to the grid until it is full, then toggle the switches to fill up the other bank. Electrical shorts are pretty common and will discharge all stored energy in all batteries connected to the grid. And when that happens, you'll just need to flick the switches so that the full batteries will keep your lights on if, for example, it's nighttime or not windy and you're relying on solar panels and/or wind turbines. These batteries will otherwise help you get through disruptions to your power supply, such as a solar eclipse, or when you've temporarily turned on a power-hungry item like a smelter. Based on where I've currently got everything else, I'll most likely put extra farm areas below the freezer, keep my barn and animal pasture above the base where some rhinos are currently hanging out, and maybe put my hospital to the left of the battery room. With the Rim Fridge mod, I'll be able to keep meals in the hospital, which will be nice for tending to patients, and by not having it too close to the bedrooms, hopefully random pawns won't drop in all the time to raid the icebox. As noted earlier, I'll likely wall off the area to the northeast of base, placing a small defensive installation near the top right bedrooms, and similarly to the south, wall things up nicely with defensive positions on the left and right sides of those areas. On the west side of base, I'll probably set up a kill box of some sort and use it as my primary defensive position for all non-wall breaching raids and packs of manhunter animals. And that's pretty much it for planning a base. Taking the time to plan out your key structures before you even unpause the game after landing on the map will really help in promoting your long-term success. And I'm not gonna lie, it's really quite satisfying to see your plans come to fruition over time, and certainly a lot more enjoyable than constantly rebuilding things because you didn't begin with the end in mind. But that's it for this episode. In the next one, we'll actually start playing the game, and I'll go over topics including setting up work priorities, schedules, how to prioritize your building projects, and how to ensure that you don't let your wealth exceed your ability to protect it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!